Representative Alleman.
Present.
Representative Angelos.
Here.
Representative Haroldson.
Here.
Representative Pendergraft.
Excuse me.
Representative Sherwood.
Here.
Representative Smith.
Here.
Chairman Bear.
Here.
Mr. Chairman, you have a quorum.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone, to House Appropriations, and welcome Representative Haroldson here to represent or share with us House Bill 232, Elections Hand Counting for Recounts. Would you please go ahead and proceed with the presentation?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Before us today, we do have hand election counts for recounts, and to kind of give a background on this bill. In this interim, I had a large number of constituents in my county come say, hey, we're really concerned that there's not a mechanism in our statutes for a hand count audit. They actually went even further and said we should get rid of the machines completely, and I pushed back on that respectfully and said I think the first step is to address the conversation of hand count audits. And so this that started a conversation that led me down the road with our clerks and with the Secretary of State, and just really kind of getting our head wrapped around this isn't something as simple as changing a little statute. There's a lot more included in that conversation. So as we started working this bill and had the kind of the back and forth conversations with those two entities, in the middle of that, we got to see this undercount issue that happened in Weston County, and kind of this idea of, wait, we don't even have a mechanism to check other than running it right back through that same tabulating machine. We don't have a mechanism to check these elections. And so what this bill does, high level, and then we'll dive into it, what this bill does is it gives us an opportunity to be able to have basically recounts done by hand. And so what this will work as is in the situations where a race is within a certain percentage, it can be recounted by hand. Clerks can call for recounts, Secretary of State could call for recounts, or we as a candidate could ask for a recount. And then there's just some mechanisms in that, what it would look like. We have all of those things in some ways in statute currently, but this gives a more prescription to that and gives more opportunity to this to almost be an audit type feel. And so it's a large bill, and we'll dive into it now. And to do that, I think we'll start page 2 and starting in section 1. You're going to see this is what we're having to address to make this change reality. 22.1.102, 22.2.104, and it just goes all the way down through. I won't read them all because it doesn't really, it does matter, but that not for me to speak on it, but just this is what we're creating and amending to make this happen. So the first kind of change we're going to see on page 217, we are actually, that's that bringing that language in. So the first change is kind of that bulk change of count of ballots by hand or of the processing of ballots to the tabulation system for an additional time or times, striking conducted for the specific purpose of counting again in any specific race based upon the criteria of, and then it goes into the statute. That right there, that language gives us the ability to touch a ballot once it's been ran through a tabulator. So under current law, you cannot touch a ballot that hasn't been ran through a tabulating machine to hand count it. That's not legal. So if it was a situation where if there needed to be a recount, all we do currently, the practice currently, what our statutes allows is we run that ballot right back through the same machine again. Well, if there was concern about an issue with the machine, and then we don't know if we're actually catching a flaw. And in the case of that issue of a ballot problem, it wasn't the machine's fault. It was actually a human error, but you can't catch it because it's going to continue to give you the same outcome out of that machine. So this would open up the ability to have that checks and balance of a hand count. If you go to page 3, one of the things that was brought to us by our clerks, and I hope to have testimony on that virtually today, was some of our dates are going to have to change. It's going to require more time out of us between election day, canvassing, those types of things. So if you go here and you look at election dates, a primary election shall be held at the regular polling place for each precinct of the first Tuesday after the first Monday in August instead of the third Monday in August. So it's shifting it back. Now, what does that mean? That's a decision that we're going to have to make as we talk about this. It does shorten up that season of campaigning a little bit as the election day moves back by 2 weeks. And then you'll see again that change. Moving forward, there's a lot that goes into basically what does that look like and all the conforming language to that. But if you go to page 5 in line 13, this talks a little bit about what it would look like. The county clerk shall appoint a counting board for the purpose of completing recounts as provided in Wyoming statute 22-16-109. The counting board under this subsection shall consist of not less than 3 members. Additionally, counting board members may be appointed if deemed necessary by the county clerk. This gives the statutory responsibility or authority to our clerks to actually put together a counting team for that. And then moving on to page 6, line 13 through 16, when being recounted by hand in accordance with that 22-16-109, the Secretary of State may promulgate rules establishing standards for counting such ballots. Obviously, we're going to have a standard of how we're going to do these ballot counts. Moving on to page 7, the county canvassing board we're going to move that from the first Friday to the second Friday, just changing that timetable to give them opportunity for hand recounts. And then moving to page 8, this is going to be where up to this point, we've just been talking about if we do hand counts, what would it look like for the process? Now we're actually getting into kind of what would constitute the ability or what mechanisms are in place for a hand count to happen. So the first one is going to be in the lower portion of page 8 from line 11 on, and it talks about on federal, statewide, or legislative offices, we are changing. There used to be a number of percentages in a number of different areas where we would see recounts possibly happen and recounts being able to be allowed by candidates. Here we get to see that we went from a 1% to a 2%. Now what this means is an overall, if we were to turn around and have a race, so I'll use a race like what we're talking about in this legislative race where there's 3 counties being represented by a single representative. If there is any one of those counties that is less than 2% difference on vote, that county would automatically be recounted. If the overall race was less than 1%, the overall race would be counted. Does that make sense? So we see that on page 8 and 9 in these paragraphs. So if it was to be a situation where a county were to be at 1.93%, that county is going to get recounted. If the entire race is at 1.93%, it would not be recounted unless the candidate themselves requested a recount. And then there's a mechanism for that we'll talk about in just a little bit. So then we go in on page 10 and it talks about ballot propositions and kind of talks about what that looks like. And then on 11, this is a pretty important piece on 4 through 7. It talks about if there's a discrepancy between the recount results from the tabulation to the hand count, we would see the canvassing board shall determine the official results of the election. So that's where we're going to have that basically that final say coming from. And then also on page 11, line 9, we see that we are actually establishing a new account, which I know that's not what we love to do, but I think that we are at a point where we do not have the ability to ask our county commissioners to take on this much extra weight without giving them a mechanism to fund it. And so the account would be created, and then as we move on, we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like financially. So on page 12, line 8, we talk about the recount of ballot propositions and the 1% variance inside of that. And then 13, it goes on and talks about, it would be constitutional amendment changes. And there's a the Secretary of State's office is going to be bringing a recommended amendment there. That's something that we have found that needs to be corrected. That was a good catch on their part. And then moving on to the page 14, we get to talk a little bit about that financial side of it. So in the prior statutes, anything that would have been less than 5%, greater than 1% or less than 5%. So let's say a candidate, myself, were to say, I feel like there was a miscount in this and that we need to recount this, and we're at 3%. It used to be under old statute that between 1% and 5%, $500 would be paid, and they would then have the ability to recount that. Well, it would just be rerun it through their machines. This would now change it a little bit. So we're getting rid of that 1% to 5%, and what we're simply saying is that anything over that 2%, so if it is 2% or more and you feel like you need to get a recount, there's going to be $1,000 basically retainer or down payment, and then up to $5,000 is going to be the cap. So if it's a situation where the race in question, it may cost the clerk $650 to hand count that race, then you would receive money back. If it's a deal where it's like, man, it cost us $4,500, they can come to you and say, hey, you need to give us another $3,500 for counting this race. If it exceeds the 5,000 on the bottom of page 15, you're going to see where it talks about that if the actual cost of conducting the recount exceeds $5,000, the county clerk may seek reimbursement of reasonable expenses from the Secretary of State. And then it talks about what reasonable expenses are. We're not paying for your pizza, we're paying for the time spent. We're not paying for extra breath mints that day, we're paying for time spent, right? And so, and then it kind of goes down through and talks about the meeting of the canvas board, and the change of that date again from second to third Wednesday. And then it continues on and just kind of some of those changes of dates. And then finally on page 18, section 3, shows there's a $200,000 appropriation to go into this fund for the purpose of recounts of election and for basically the reimbursement to county clerks for this. So I know it's 18 pages of a bill and I ran through it fairly fast, so I do stand for any questions that you guys may have, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. So questions for the bringer. Representative Sherwood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Do you intend that this new account, the election recount account, would be able to be utilized for both hand counts and electronic, or is it limited to just by hand? Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Representative Sherwood. So if you take a deep dive into the bill, it's pretty prescriptive of what that looks like. From what we've seen, an electronic recount won't breach that $5,000 mark, from what we've seen. Now there may be an exception to that I'm unaware of, but for them to just retabulate the bills through the electronic tabulators, from our experience, has not breached that amount. But again, it could, and this is going to be for recounts. I don't know where someone would request, though, to get a recount but not have it be a hand count. Maybe there would. Maybe someone would rather have the machine count again. But that would be their call.
So Representative Harrelson, so just to be clear, the person who's requesting this hand count or recount gets to choose whether it's just running it through the machine or a hand count.
Mr. Chairman, that is correct.
Thank you. Further questions for the bringer? I have a couple. So this changing to 2% on these certain races, how did that, I know you explained it just a little bit more in depth. How did we come to that conclusion that that was the right number?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. So honestly, that was a conversation that was back and forth with our clerks in the Secretary of State's office. Because what they were saying is, on some races, legislative races or whole state races, 2%'s a lot. But you go into some smaller races, 2% isn't much at all. And so that's where we get that carve out of if it's less than 2% in a county, there's a recount in that county. But if the overall number is 1%, then we do a full count, all county recount on that race. And so what we were trying to do is cast the net a little wider, get rid of the 1 to 5% window and then the over 5% window, clean things up and make it incredibly simple. The state's gonna call a recount if it's percentage or less. And then if you request, it doesn't matter, you could come in there and say, I lost by 50%. Well, you can call the recount if you're wanting to pay for it, that's totally fine. Now, the difference is this. That's gonna be a very substantial amount of money if it's a statewide race, and you're gonna pay for 23 counties. I mean, at that point, you're gonna put some serious money down to make this reality. And so we wanted there to be two sides. One, that if someone really truly feels they need to have a recount, they get the opportunity for a hand recount, but yet they have to have some skin in the game financially. We didn't want it to just be a free, I feel like I got a disservice and I want a hand count, but I don't want to put any money towards it. That won't be the case. At the same time, if it's close enough where we're like, man, that's really, really close, we have the mechanism for that auto recount. There's also the ability in here for county commissioner or for clerks, if they see something like we saw in Weston County where they're like, man, I just have a concern, they can call for an audit on a race. And then also in here, the Secretary of State's position currently is they get to do an audit of a race in every single district, or every single county, sorry. And this changes that to offer the ability to make that hand count as well. But, so really at the end of the day, that's where the financial side has to come in, that there would be a reimbursement opportunity and option.
All right, Representative Haroldson, on page 15, we've determined that the county clerk will determine the cost to be assessed to the bringer of the request for a recount. And they have a money range here between $1,000 and $5,000. And I heard you say that, you know, based on machine recounts, $5,000 is the number, but I'd like to know how you came up with this range of $1,000 to $5,000. And I assume that you'd need to be able to apply that to this three-person panel that's going to do a hand count. So please describe how that's going to be paid for and how these numbers would apply to that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. So a little background of where we got the number. We heard 7,500 thrown out, we heard 6,000 thrown out, we heard 4,500 thrown out. Ultimately, we went to the clerks and said, what do you feel is going to cover the average cost in the county? Now, I'll back up and say, our county, Platte County, and Laramie County are completely different counties. So we had to put that buffer in there. Talking to my clerk, he said, I would be very, 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 very surprised if we ever even came close to 5,000. Like, something would have to go very, very wrong for it to be $5,000 for a recount. Now, when you get to, say, Laramie County, that's a difference, right? So what that looks like is when we go in here and we look at the per diem, the wage, we go through what they can be reimbursed on, the county clerk would keep track of hours for staff or for those that are in the recount. They would compile all of this, and then they would then submit that amount of money or submit what the cost is above and beyond the $1,000 down payment or retainer to then come up with that between 1,000 and 5,000 number, which would then be given to the candidate upon completion of count and this is it, let's back up. If they find a discrepancy in count, then that payment is no longer going to be assessed, and there will be a reimbursement. So if it's a situation where they found a problem, obviously that does not apply anymore, and that's how our current statute reads. So this just realigns into that current statute. So did that, Mr.
Yes.
Chairman, did that answer your question?
Thank you, Representative Haroldson. Further questions for the bringer? Representative Sherwood.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You had mentioned briefly that the Secretary of State currently has the ability to do like an audit of every district. And so on page 10, lines 13 through 19, we're bringing in some language here that allows the Secretary of State to recount not more than one federal, statewide or legislative question or race. And I'm wondering if it's either the way I'm reading this or if it's intentional. The way I'm reading it is it's limiting that ability to say not more than one legislative question or race. What if there are two legislative races that there were concerns about and the Secretary of State felt that they needed to audit? Does this language limit that? Thank you.
Representative Harrelson.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and Representative Sherwood. So this is more the random audit conversation. If there is a concern that comes forward from the clerks to the Secretary of State, there's plenty. If you go to page 16, 10 through 17, you start seeing the recount initiated by a county clerk. You see if the recount is initiated by the Secretary of State, and the costs. I mean, there's other mechanisms in there if there's a concern that we're like, hey, like, I mean, I keep using Weston County just because we had that concern that came up there. In the case of that, it doesn't take, I mean, anyone can wake up and go, wait a second, there's something just isn't right here. And so the clerks have the ability, the candidate has the ability, the Secretary of State has the ability to move forward with conversation in those lines. But there is prescriptive language of how many just are going to be done, even if there is no concern. Like, this is just an audit. This is just a checkup conversation. And I believe that the Secretary of State's office will speak more towards that conversation when they give testimony.
Okay. Further questions for the bringer? All right, with that, we'll ask the Secretary of State's office to come forward, please. Is there anyone in the room that wishes to testify on this bill? Okay, anyone else? All right. Welcome, Mr. Secretary.
Yes, thank you. Great committee you got here. Well, thank you. I'm Chuck Gray, the Wyoming Secretary of State, and to my left is Joe Rubino, our General Counsel, our Policy Director, our Public Records Custodian. He does a lot of stuff in our office. And I want to express my support for House Bill 232, elections and counting for recounts. First, broadly, I'm in support of the concept of providing a more complete form of verification of the machines. And I've always been a verify guy, you know, that we need to have verification of these machines. And I feel like there's a certain sense of resistance to the idea of a verification of the voting machines. But I really think this is one of the many solutions that are on the table to increase confidence in our elections by ensuring that candidates and the public at large have the option to hand recount as provided by the bill. I think Representative Harrelson did a pretty good walk through the bill, and he worked a lot with our office and with the clerks in getting the balance right so that this could be done after the election is held, but then also creating a procedure for this hand verification. Of course, we saw in Weston County that the hand verification showed that the machine count was in error. And that was out of a 3-day colloquy after we identified that error in our office and asked the county clerk up there to conduct that hand recount. That did happen the day before the canvassing, the day of the canvassing board, and the agreement happened the day before the canvassing board, and that showed that the machine count was indeed inaccurate. Now, I want to highlight the pertinent changes to 22-16-109B, which details the process for triggering automatic hand recounts. Specifically, Romanet 1, which requires that for federal, statewide, or legislative offices in which the difference between two candidates is less than 2% in that county, then there is an automatic recount. But if it's 1% in the entire state or district, it triggers an automatic recount across the entire state or district. So we get the statewides in certain instances where a hand recount will be triggered. But in addition, that county-to-county colloquy will happen as well. Romanet 3 specifies that other offices, including county, commission, and municipal, would largely operate the same as now. And that was a concession to the clerks. The clerks proposed that that infrastructure, and that is to try to, I'll let them sort of describe where they were coming from in that, but that was an ask of the clerks. This same principle applies to the automatic recount of a ballot proposition, providing that a hand recount of a statewide ballot proposition will be undertaken if the proposition receives a number of votes greater or lesser within 1% of the number of votes required for passage, and for local if the proposition receives a number of votes greater or lesser within 2% of the number of votes required for passage. Second, I would highlight the recount as requested by a candidate under 22-16-110 would specify whether the recount should be conducted by hand or by machine, giving the candidate the option. Third, I want to speak to the appropriation, handling the issue of what happens when a candidate does not have an automatic recount, hand recount triggered, and wishes to ask for one. I think it's a balance in terms of the deposit versus the appropriation. And I think that the clerks wanted it a little higher, I wanted it a little lower, and I think we ended up at a middle ground at the 5,000. And one of the things that the clerks insisted on was that there was that capacity if they went over, and our office the Secretary of State's office will verify that the state would provide for that reimbursement, and that's the creation of that account. And I do think that's appropriate, but I can tell you, we go through that expense report as we did in the 24 election very extensively. And there were some things, like pizza that we did not reimburse. So we will keep an eye on that and protect the account, protect the money of the citizens of Wyoming, and I know the clerks will as well. But to achieve that balance right, it is important that we create this account. It is difficult to foresee how often this will be used, especially with respect to the recounts requested by affidavit. But I do think that we're achieving the right balance with that initial appropriation. But I'm very in support of this bill. I mean, we see time and time again for voter confidence and also for integrity of the system, we truly have to have some mechanism for a hand recount under Wyoming state law outside of the canvassing board. And this will allow for that.
Questions for the Secretary?
One thing, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Mr. Secretary.
Mr. Rubino, that one amendment you had identified on that.
Yep, Mr.
We do have one
Chairman
suggestion for an amendment.
and
Go ahead,
members
Mr.
of the
Rubino.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Joe Rubino with the Secretary of State's office. If you go on to, let's start with the section 22-16-111, beginning on page 12 of the bill. It's really on page 13, but it'll help if we just start from the beginning. So subsection A, Romanet 1, capital A discusses if it's a statewide proposition and receives a number of votes greater or lesser within 1%. This is existing statutory language, and it's kind of how you ferret out what that difference is, how close that is. And so I'm not going to go very much in detail into that, but if it's within 1% and we determine if it's a statewide proposition, within 1%, that triggers, it's parallel to the statewide, federal, or entire district, that 1%. But going on to capital B on page 13, there was, in the drafting process, I think there was some legacy language that was carried over from capital A onto capital B, and it begins on page 13, line 5. At the end of line 5, it says the 2% variance shall be calculated based upon the total number of votes cast on the proposition, except for constitutional amendments, in which case the variance shall be calculated based upon the total number of ballots cast in the election. Well, capital B is referring to things that aren't a statewide ballot proposition, and a constitutional amendment is a statewide ballot proposition. So we would suggest deleting, starting on page 13, line 5, beginning with the 2, and then delete through the election on line 10 of page 13. So again, beginning on page 13, line 5, the two, delete line 6, 7, 8, 9, and then the election.
Mr. Rubino, I think we have it. Go ahead. Do you have others?
No, that's it.
Okay, thank you very much. Any questions for Mr. Rubino or Secretary of State? Go ahead, Representative Smith.
Thank you. If this law was already enacted, do you know how many recounts with that 2% margin you would have had to recount?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Rubino, go ahead.
Representative Smith, in the general, we did not have any that were within that 2%. Within the primary, it was a different story. Within the counties, I'll go through a couple here, I was going through kind of anticipating that question. In Natrona County, Senate District 28, that was over the 1% threshold. That was within one county, that district. That would have been over the 1%, but it was within 2%. In House District 2 in Weston County only, House District 8 in Laramie County, House District 9, House District 27 in Bighorn County, House District 42 in Laramie, 7 or 8 in the 2024 primary election.
All right, any further questions? Hearing none, thank you for being here, Mr. Secretary of State.
Yeah, well,
Mr. Rubino.
Mr. Chairman, one
Go ahead,
more
Secretary
thing.
of State.
From the Weston County experience, the legislative races can be done in 2 to 3 hours. It might be a little more than that, but it happened in the morning on the canvassing board, and it was
Mr.
pretty
Secretary, I
quick.
assume that was a highly familiar group of canvassing personnel for that particular count, wasn't it?
Well, Mr. Chairman, they brought in the Crook County clerk, but and the canvassing board, but this was an unprecedented procedure. And was very happy the day before when the county clerks, we had requested this. At first, I wasn't sure it was gonna happen. And then on Thursday afternoon, we got a call, and we fully hashed it out. After initially it looked like it was not gonna happen. And then, and it is unprecedented. I mean, it's the first hand count in, I'm confident, in decades on a legislative race.
Mr. Secretary, we appreciate their work and your work in that particular issue, and hopefully there's a great outcome there.
Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Childress, the way we're going to do this, and for the public's edification, we're going to start our public testimony now, but we're going to give preference to, first of all, we'll go with the clerk that we have online, Ms. Mary Fiegler. We'll go do that clerk, then we're going to go to public comment, and then we'll do the association and lobbyists after that. So if you could please bring Ms. Fiegler online, please. And we're going to limit, we've got some time here, but we've got a lot of people wanting to speak to this. So we're going to limit the speakers to 5 minutes from this point forward. Plenty of time, but just want to make sure everybody understands there is a bit of a limit. Go ahead, Ms. Childress.
Mr. Chairman, I have promoted Mary Fiegler. She has not accepted that yet. Ms. Fiegler, you'll need to click on that pop-up.
In the meantime, anyone here that's going to speak here in the room, if you could come forward, please, and we'll just be ready to tee you up. We'll go ahead and go a little bit out of order while we're waiting on Ms. Fiegler. We'll go ahead with Ms. Simons. Go ahead. Ms. Simons, welcome to the Appropriations Committee.
Thank you, Chairman. My name is Gail Simmons. I run a nonpartisan nonprofit, Civics 307 and YVote. My background is in database process improvement, which I did both in the U.S. Navy and at General Electric. You've been provided a handout with the background facts in support of my comments. I believe this is another of the many, many bills that address a problem that does not exist. I believe it is inherently flawed. Flawed in the assumption of a problem, flawed in presenting a solution that actually creates a problem, flawed in changing primary election day to accommodate that solution, flawed in further undermining belief in election integrity, which I do not believe actually occurs. We have high election integrity. Two recent threshold recounts in legislative districts resulted in just one sole vote change and no impact on the outcomes. While other states are reducing their thresholds, this bill is doubling ours. Only the District of Columbia is at 1%, none are at 2%, and majority are at 0.5%. In the past 3 election cycles, a quick check that I did, which is probably not completely accurate, the number of legislative race recounts would have been 5 in 2020, 3 in 2022, and 5 in 2024. I did that on overall, not the individual county, because it was so difficult. The greatest flaw in the bill is in requiring hand counts to verify the results of machine counts. Machine counting has greater accuracy, efficiency, cost effectiveness, and integrity than hand counting. There is not one single credible academic or case study that has shown otherwise. I refer you to the handout for the facts supporting this. There are also no parameters on page 13 on propositions beyond having an affidavit signed by 25 electors. This opens an opportunity for major disruption without any limiting factors. In fact, I would encourage, if you leave this in, to put some other parameter than just 25 people. The recount requirement, in my mind, is the equivalent of having your physician's diagnosis fact-checked by a witch doctor. To accommodate the time and accuracy inefficiencies of hand counting, the bill pulls in the election day to the beginning of August rather than the middle of the month. As a result, all the preceding deadlines are pulled forward as well. None of this is needed with machine recounts. The upside for voters is that the earlier date will shut off the deluge of ugly, deceptive, and inflammatory campaign mailers choking mailboxes this primary season. In summary, hand counts are inaccurate, time-consuming, costly, and lack the processing integrity of machines. If the desire is to increase the incidence of recounting from 1% to 2%, it does no harm provided it is done by machine. If the intent is to provide for a recount for an anomalous result, as identified in Weston County, it should be limited to that. And I stand for questions.
Any questions for Ms. Simmons? Ms. Simmons, I do have a question. I know you're a big proponent of voter participation, as am I.
Absolutely.
You have a note here that you don't believe that that there is a voter confidence issue on our machines. Both anecdotally from my campaign and from poll data across the state, I have different data, different outcomes, and a different perspective on that. Do you have any other additional perspective as to your conclusion that it doesn't build confidence?
So Mr. Chairman, that result that I gave you was actually nationwide. My belief is that there has been a concerted effort, a very vocal, widespread effort to diminish the confidence within this state of machine tabulating. They aren't really voting machines, they're tabulating machines. And I believe that that lack of confidence that you see is as a result of that. I think it is in specific areas, and I think we do need to address it. I think the overall decrease in confidence in our election integrity needs to be addressed at every level, because I do not believe it is based on fact, it is based on fear, and needs to be addressed as such.
Okay, thank you.
And just one thing other, the fact that it's based on fear doesn't change the fact that people feel that way. It's simply we need to address it.
Thank you. All right.
Mr. Chairman?
Do we have?
Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead. Representative Harrelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Simmons, thanks for coming today. I appreciate you being here. So I guess the question that I do have as a candidate, and if it was a situation in a race, and let's say that we had a 0.75% offset in a race, and that automatically goes for a recount, no matter if this passes or doesn't. And then it goes and it gets retabulated by the same machine. That's, to me, the question I have is, as a candidate, and I know you've ran and you've been in that position, is there not a point in place where you would love to see the fact of maybe that there is a confirming of that vote?
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead, Ms.
Representative Haroldson, most of the counties have more than one machine, and so I do not believe that it is necessarily true that it would be the exact same machine. And in fact, my confidence, given the already statutorily required checks on our systems, pre-audits, post-audits, random auditing. No, I do not believe that the hand counts would change my belief at all. Actually, quite the contrary.
Thank you. Further questions? Ms. Simmons, thank you for being here. Do we have Clerk Fiegler online?
Mr. Chairman, Mary Fiegler has declined
Okay,
the invite.
that's fine. Let's go on down here. Let's go ahead and get Clerk Irvin from the County Clerks Association.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me okay?
I can, thank you, and welcome to the Appropriations Committee.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate you letting me join remotely. I had every intention of being there today, but quite honestly, the flu had a different idea, so I appreciate joining remotely. Mr. Chairman, Representative Haroldson put a lot of work into this effort, and we really appreciate the time he took to work alongside us to craft something that when it gets to your committee, we can say it's workable. You know, that's always our goal. If the policy decision is to move towards a hand recount, we want to make sure we can get up and say it's workable. And Mr. Chairman, this is workable. We do have two small amendments we'd like to offer. Our group met on a Thursday and we talked about this, and they're just two very small ones. So Mr. Chairman, with your permission, I'd like to go through those.
Go ahead, Mr. Irvin.
The first would be page 10, line 22. After the word proposition, insert the words or race. This would just make it clear that the county clerk has the ability to recount anything that appears on the ballot, whether it's a proposition or a commissioner race, clerk race, whatever it may be. The second would be, and I think this will probably garner a little bit more discussion, would be page 16, line 2. Before the word wages, insert facility rental fees. This was a question that was raised by our larger counties, Laramie and Natrona specifically, that if they have a full-scale countywide recount that they're doing by hand, they may need to rent a facility that has more floor space, that the county itself may not have that facility. And so this would just, if those bigger counties had to rent a place to conduct this hand recount, they could do it and have that reimbursed. Mr. Chairman, if this had been an interim study, we would be able to offer more data to you about the time it would take. Right now, the only real case study we have is one instance where the Campbell County clerk hosted a recount or a hand recount demonstration and gathered a little bit of data. And so, Mr. Chairman, that's why we're asking for a measured approach in this, to start slowly and just allow us time to work on it. And so, Mr. Chairman, I really don't have much more to offer than we appreciate Representative Haroldson's efforts on this. And this goes back to Representative Sherwood's question about the recount account. If there were some consideration that recount account could also apply to 2216-109B, I, and II, those are the automatic recounts. You heard Mr. Rubino say this 2% threshold would have opened up about 7 or 8 recounts in the primary. Those are being shouldered by the counties. And Mr. Chairman, if this committee would consider it, we would sure appreciate if that account would also apply to those automatic hand recounts. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, I would stand for any questions.
Thank you. Questions for Clerk Irvin? Clerk Irvin, I do have a question. You had mentioned that, you want a measured approach. Do you consider this bill a measured approach? I think we've got other bills out there that go a lot further, but would you consider this a measured approach?
Mr. Chairman, you are right. There are other bills out there that certainly go further than this one. And so of the bills that our group talked about, this would be the most measured. And by measured, I mean the automatic hand recount is limited to those statewide, federal, and legislative races. Those are all vote for one races. In Weston County's general election canvassing board, we heard about the recount procedure. That was actually written by Clerk Freeze in Fremont County. And it was a really good procedure, we feel like, and we could work in the vote for one races more simply than your school boards, your hospital districts. And so, although this is a pretty big change, Mr. Chairman, I would say it's measured in comparison to some other bills that are out there, yes.
All right, thank you. All right, Ms. Childress, we do appreciate you being here, Clerk Irvin. And
Thank you.
Can we call in Clerk Freeze, please, to finish up the association, then we'll go on to the equalities. Then we'll go on to public comment with Ms. Marquette. Marquardt. Welcome, Clerk Freeze. We appreciate you joining us here in the Appropriations Committee. Please proceed.
Thank you very much, Chairman and Committee. I'm Julie Freeze, Fremont County Clerk, speaking for the association. Our chairman, our president, actually, Clerk Irvin has done a great job in discussing what we discussed on Thursday. A couple things I just want to offer up so that people understand the process. So we did come up with a process for Weston County, and I do want everybody to know the machines did their job in Weston County. The problem with that is that she had a mistake on her ballot, and when she had them corrected, it changes where your bubbles go because she had a line missing. So it changes your bubbles, which is how the machine counts. She sent out, we're all trying to hurry, get our ballots out. She sent out the first set of ballots thinking they were the corrected ones. And then the second set came in, not thinking, oh my gosh, did I already send out some ballots? So she had both ballots out there, the ballots that were wrong, and then the ballots that were correct. When they went through the machine, they can only count the bubbles that they see. And so the machine did do its job. Unfortunately, it didn't do the job of making sure that the person that people were voting for was correct. So the procedure that we gave for counting the ballots was our only option. In talking to Clerk Irvin that night, I said the only option is a hand count. And so we came up with a solution on how to do that, and we were happy to help out that way. So I do think that, and Representative Harrelson said this, is there's another bill out there to get rid of all the voting machines. And I don't think that's necessary at this point, obviously, because I do trust the machines, but it would be good for us to dip our toe in the water, as I would say, and come up with a way to help other people get that confidence in our machines that we have. So again, we agree with a way to do that for our constituents and are happy to do that. One thing that I do want to mention, it does say that there will be rules and regulations done by the Secretary of State's office, which I hope will be in conjunction with the clerks, obviously. But we have no adjudication of how to count votes in Wyoming, meaning just because we have instructions on a ballot does not mean everybody follows that. So adjudication means that when you're going through the ballots, you have to have the methods by which to figure out what was the voter thinking, which is an unfortunate thing. And that's why you have machines. That's why in 2000, with the hanging chads at the in Florida, that's why they went to machines that would, be able to do this much better than they used to, is to make sure that there was no human subject, about what we think that people were thinking. So adjudication is going to be super important and another big lift, which we're all ready to put the work in on. And I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Okay. Questions for Clerk Freeze? All right. Thank you very much for being here, and thank you for that
allowing us to
testimony.
do it by Zoom. Thank you.
All right, now we'll go on to the public. If we could have Ms. Marquette.
Hello?
Hello, Ms. Marquette, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I always struggle with your last name, but if you could please state your name, and just so you know, we've got a 5-minute limit on testimony right now. Quite a bit of time, but if you could limit it to 5 minutes for your comments, we'd appreciate to hear from you here in the Appropriations Committee.
My name's Dawn Marcourt. I'm from LaBarge. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, for this opportunity I just want some clarification on this bill. The title of the bill suggests a focus on hand counting for recounts. However, the inclusion of provisions allowing for the use of electronic tabulation creates ambiguity. Is the intent of the bill to mandate hand counts for all recounts, or to provide flexibility between hand counts and electronic tabulation? If electronic tabulation is retained as an option, what criteria will determine when it is used versus a hand count? Should this be at the discretion of the candidate requesting the hand recount, the county canvassing board, or another authority? There's just some things in there that if it's going to where you guys are gonna want to do a hand recount to check on these machines that they are doing right, there's some mays that should be replaced with shells in the bill. And then the other point I kind of wanted to make was the composition of the counting board, where it says there should not be less than 3 members. I would like to see that to become 4, and I would like to see that become consistent with 2 members from each major political party that the county chairman should nominate as a county board member, and then have the county clerk then certify that. And that was just some of my comments on the bill. I just would like to see that if we're gonna do hand counts, that's what we're gonna do if there's a problem with the counting of the electronic machines. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Marcourt, and again, I apologize for brutalizing your name, but we appreciate the input. And are there any questions for Ms. Marcourt? Okay. Thank you very much for being here. We appreciate your testimony. All right, let's move on to Ms. Carpio.
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Carpio is not attending.
Okay, how about Ms. Desario?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee. I am Jenny Desaro, the Executive Director of the Equality State Policy Center, a nonpartisan organization of 30 years working on fair elections and transparent government in Wyoming. The Equality State Policy Center is on and against this bill. Hand counting, even when it is an audit, is expensive, time-consuming, and inaccurate, as human error still exists. The Campbell County test of hand counting scenarios that was previously mentioned determined that they were looking at the cost and accuracy, personnel, time associated with hand counting ballots. The trials demonstrated that the processing of ballots by hand would require hundreds of volunteers and cost up to 1.3 million for Campbell County. This county, as of November 5th, 2024, had 17,109 registered voters. Now, that number is for the county, the entire ballot, and I recognize that this bill would be a portion of that. I'm not sure how to break down the number to be able to add more content there, but that's the number that I have. We have many concerns with this bill. The fact that the hand counting process is still undecided upon, the amount of dollars in the election recount fund seems a little low, and there lacks clear articulation to what the this bill is trying to solve. The machine recounting the Weston County, the clerks did come up with a great solution, and that worked, but that is not a typical scenario that happens when a recount is requested by candidates. And again, just to remind you all that only 1 in 4 voters turned out in the 2024 primary election. We are really unclear as to how moving the primary election date will increase voter participation. And that's just a little side note. The mandate for hand recounts, where modern electric systems have proven accuracy, wastes time, money, and human resources. Thank you, and I stand for questions.
Thank you, Ms. DeSaro. Do we have questions for Ms. DeSaro? All right, no questions. Thank you very much for being here. We appreciate your testimony. All right, is there any further public comment? Seeing none, we'll close public comment. Committee, what's your pleasure? I'm sorry, who said that? Representative Angelos, motion to move the bill. Second? Seconded by Representative Smith. All right, let's go through the bill here. We've got quite a lot. So, page 1. Page 2. Page 3. Please stop me if you want to make a motion. Page 4. Page 5. Page 6. Page 7. Page 8. Page 9. Page 10. Representative Sherwood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So on page 10, lines 21 through 23, I would like to offer the amendment so that this would read, the county clerk shall have the discretion to recount any ballot proposition or race, either by precinct or election district.
Okay, you've heard the motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Representative Harrelson.
Just a
Any
question real
discussion?
quick on that.
Go ahead, Representative Harrelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to the bringer of the amendment, are you wanting to place "or" in front of election?
Correct. So
Okay.
it would read either by precinct or election district. And if I've misunderstood, I'm seeing the word precinct in line 22 and 23. No.
Mr. Chairman, I believe it was just "or" race. I didn't think we had to put after precinct, put "or," but I may be wrong.
Go ahead, Representative Sherwood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the clean amendment, I guess, would say, the county clerk shall have the discretion to recount any ballot proposition or race, and then it would read either by precinct, election district, or precinct. Is that repetitive, that we're mentioning precinct twice?
Go ahead, Representative Harrelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. From what I remember, the testimony was just to put "or" race in, and I sent out a phone a friend and I haven't gotten a reply back, but I'm waiting.
Mr. Chairman, while we wait, I'm happy to amend the amendment just to address the or race.
All right, you've heard the amendment to the amendment. It's actually just, we're just going to group this into one amendment. Any other discussion on this amendment? Seeing none. All those in favor of Sherwood's amendment, say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. That carries. All right, we'll come back to that. If you get some more information, Representative Harrelson, let us know. Okay. Any others on page 10? Page 11? Representative Sherwood, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to offer the amendment on page 11, line 12, removing the word hand so that this election recount account could be used for any kind of recount done by hand or by electronic tabulation. And it is my intent that this would also apply to automatic recounts.
Okay, you've heard the motion. Is there a second? No second.
Could the bringer repeat the motion, please?
Okay, go ahead. Representative Sherwood, please repeat the motion.
Thank you. Again, this stems from my concern that we're limiting the use of this account to just hand recounts. My motion would be on page 11, line 12, to remove the word hand so that it would read for costs related to administering recounts, with my intention being that it could be used for hand recounts, electronic tabulation, or when there is an automatic trigger of a recount.
Okay, you've heard the motion. Is there a second? Seconded by Representative Harrelson.
I'll second that, just mostly for discussion, if that's okay, Mr. Chairman.
That's fine. Go ahead. Let's have discussion on this amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If you don't mind, could we call up Mr. Rubino and just ask if that would actually do what we're intending it to do?
Okay, Mr. Rubino,
If
could
that
you
would
please
open
come
that
forward?
up.
Go ahead, Mr. Rubino.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's two ways that you could do it. You could, if you wanted to take out hand, then you could cite to as provided in 2216-113, which discusses the expense of the recount, and then that discusses both by hand. And it's just linking to the deposit. And my apologies, Mr. Chairman, I'm reading through that right now to make sure that I'm not. Yeah, so I would link to the statute, 2216-113.
Thank you, Mr. Rubino. Any further questions for Mr. Rubino?
Mr. Chairman, just looking at page 16, line 10 through 14, we see where recounts initiated by the county clerk. Mr. Rubino, would the percentage recounts be initiated by the county clerk? Would that be considered a county clerk initiated recount, or is that a Secretary of State initiated recount? Who would actually have the authority to initiate the recount if we say had a less than 2% or a less than 1% recount requirement?
Go ahead, Mr. Rubino.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Harrelson, I think I understand your question. I believe that's part of a different part of it. So the automatic, let's see, the recount is initiated by the county clerk, county canvassing board, or required by 2216-109B. (2216-109B) references on page 8, beginning at line 8, references the automatic thresholds. So it's not initiated by the county clerk, county canvassing board. It's required by that automatic recount trigger. And then that's what's to be paid by the county right now, not the election recount account.
Mr. Chairman, so just, and that was my concern, because I believe that removing that doesn't do what we're intending. As we've heard from the clerks asking for help on the automatic recounts, that would not automatically give them that ability. That's actually something else that we would have to go and dig into the green books and figure out an amendment to make reality if that was the will the body as we did that. So just, I would ask for a no vote on the amendment, just simply because I don't believe it actually accomplishes what the intentions are.
Okay, any further discussion? Representative Sherwood?
I can make a friendly amendment to my amendment. And just remove the word hand on page 11, line 12, and leave it as that.
Okay, you've heard the motion. This is just to strike the word hand, which was the original motion actually, on page 11, line 12. It's been seconded, or is there any further discussion? No? All those in favor of the motion say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no? No. Okay, that motion is defeated. Any further motions on page 11? Page 12. Page 13.
Mr. Chairman,
Representative Smith.
I'd like to go with the Secretary of State's recommendation on page 13, starting at line 5, getting rid of the 2, and then also lines 6, 7, 8, 9, and then on line 10, the election.
Okay, you've heard the motion. Is there a second? Seconded by Representative Haroldson. Any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all those in favor of this motion brought by Representative Smith, say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. That carries. All right, any further motions on page 13? Page 14. Page 15. Page 16. Any motions on page 16, Representative Haroldson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Page 16, line 2, and I think before wages, I would like to insert the facility rental fees.
Okay, you've heard the motion by Representative Haroldson. Do I have a second? Seconded by Representative Sherwood. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of Representative Haroldson motion say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. That carries. Any further motions on page 16? Page 17. Page 18. All right, hearing no motions on page 18, is there any discussion on the bill in its entirety? Seeing none, Ms. Childress, would you please take the roll on House Bill 232?
Roll call vote, House Bill 232 do pass with amendments. Representative Alleman?
Aye.
Representative Angelos? Aye. Representative Haroldson?
Aye.
Representative Pendergraft voted aye via absentee. Representative Sherwood?
No.
Representative Smith?
Aye.
Chairman Bear?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, 6 aye, 1 no.
Thank you, Ms. Childress. Okay, that passes, and with that dispatched, we'll be moving on to House Bill 270, and I will be handing the gavel over to Representative Sherwood while I present the bill.
Welcome, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. All right. If you're ready, Madam Chairman, I'll go ahead and present the bill.
We are ready, thank you.
Thank you. So thank you all for being here today and entertaining House Bill 270, Permanent Mineral Trust Fund Spending Policy. I have provided you with documentation as to how this looks visually, and that is out of your data book from 2025, and I want to say this is page 17. And so if you can pull that up, it's titled Fiscal Year 2025 Estimated Spending Policy. Oh, got the wrong one here, hang on. 2025 Estimated Spending Policy, Wyoming Statute 9-4-719D, Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund. So, Madam Chairman and committee, this particular bill has to do with how much money is available to spend, and our current spending policy is to take 5% of the 5-year rolling average of those earnings off the Wyoming Permanent Mineral Trust Fund. So this is earnings that go into our general fund and then are allowed to be spent. Currently, it's at 5%. There have been efforts in the past to decrease that spending policy to 4.5%. And here is the overall concept. If we reduce this percentage, then the excess of this 0.5% that we're reducing it by will return to the Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund reserve account. And members of this committee will recall from 2 years ago, House Bill 89, we created an account, this account in particular, that would be stockpiled to 5 times our spending policy, up to 7 times our spending policy, with an effort to get higher rate of return in this account. Once it reaches that 7 times, as you can see on page 17, the additional funds would then flow into the corpus of the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund, our main savings account. And then you would have a higher rate of return again, so it would flow back down to our general fund. So the resulting 4.5% would actually be a higher volume of money for the state to spend on its operating expenses. So this is an effort to funnel down our spending policy so that we live within our means, put more money into savings, and then allow the interest and dividends from our savings account to give us more money available to spend. So with that, I will just point out in the bill where that takes place. It's on page 2, line 1 and 2. We strike the 5% and we insert 4.5%. And I'll stand for questions. I do have Mr. Richards here for further detail and expounding on consequences, but I'll stand for questions, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, committee. Are there questions for our chairman or Mr. Richards?
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And I'll throw this out there and either one of you guys can bite on it. Obviously, as we talk about this 5% and the 4.5%, technically, the legislature is not held by this, but it has been practice and policy, correct, to hold into that 5% window. So if we were to bring to this 4.5 window, explain to me kind of that scope and sequence of what that would look like, setting the legislature aside, who would be abiding by this 4.5% window, basically spending limit? Can you kind of explain that? And I'm showing my green behind the ears while I'm asking that question, but just wanted to clarify.
Madam Chairman, Representative Harrelson, I'll attempt to, and I'll ask Mr. Richards to expound upon it if I don't get it 100% correct or if he's got additional information, but this would restrict the amount of funds available initially because we're certainly getting a certain amount of return on these investments in our Permanent Mineral Trust Fund. And then as we grow the corpus of that, you would have additional funds available in the future. This policy would actually restrict those funds being available for profiling for spending in the future. So this is a policy that we live within, and we have had in the past to adjust this up and down based on our needs as a government to provide services when maybe those revenues weren't there. So this really is, how much are we going to take off of our savings and how much of it are we going to put back into the corpus of the savings? So with that, if there's anything you'd like to add to that, Mr. Richards.
Madam Chair, Representative Harrelson, just to supplement 2 things. One, the name itself, spending policy amount, I think is perhaps a bit of a misnomer. It really is more a distribution policy amount where it is restricting the state treasurer's office as to where the funds should go. It really does not restrict the elected legislators on how much they spend. And then secondly, which accounts would be impacted. I think on the fiscal note, it mentions the SIPA fund, and a subset of that SIPA fund is the Public School Foundation Program. It gets 45% of that. And then the Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund Reserve account would be the beneficiary.
Welcome, Representative Pendergraft. If you have any questions for the bringer of the bill or Mr. Richards, that's where we're at right now.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Sorry, I guess we'll call it a late follow-up. So basically, it's almost like an orifice where we cannot pull out faster than a certain percentage, 4.5%, meaning that, let's say we have a 12% return, we're keeping that return X number of percent in and only allowing 4.5% out. Is that, I'm getting head nods. Okay, you don't have to answer yet. Next question I'm going to throw on there and you can answer them both. Can you give me the history? So we've said it's been moved around a little bit. Can you give me the history? Obviously, it's currently 5%. We're looking at 4.5%. What's the history?
Madam Chairman, through you to Representative Harrelson, yes, the answer is yes, that it would work like an orifice, restricting the amount so that we've got more to flow in the future. But that opening in that orifice would grow as the corpus grows and the resulting, I think right now we look at almost 30% or more of our state funding comes from these investments. So I would anticipate that unless other funds continue to grow at the same rate, other sources of revenue grow at the same rate, that our investments would grow as far as a percentage that it provides for our funding. And so this is a method to ensure that that continues to happen. The argument 2 years ago for the reserve account being set at 5X and 7X, we have flows that come out of that, which lead to, you can see that on this page. So there's constantly money coming out, but once we get to that 5X to 7X, the revenue off of investment in that account should cover those flows. So we really end up with a constant flow. And once it grows beyond that, and we have the corpus of the Permanent Trust Fund, that's when the size of the orifice, I believe, would grow. Historically, I believe the most recent major effort was in 2016. Representative Harshman brought this exact same measure, and shortly after that, we saw coal prices really fall, coal production fell, and the state was in a bit of a bind. And so he rapidly changed it back with another bill to get that back up to the 5% funding instead of 4.5. So always, whenever we can, we want to try to save. There's two things I would say about the current atmosphere versus then. Two things. One is we don't have that on the horizon, that an expectation that our mineral revenues are going to fall off. I think Craig has forecast for quite some time pretty well flat in that area. We continue to see our investments perform better and better as we keep more money in the corpus and allow for bigger investments in that regard. And sales tax continues to grow. So having said that, there's probably no better time than the present to start looking at putting a little more money in savings and trying to grow the capability on our savings account returns.
If there are no other questions from the committee, I would open it up for testimony from agencies or the executive branch. And if there's no one there, open it up for public testimony. Welcome, and if you would please state your name for the committee.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, my name is Tate Mullen. I'm the Government Relations Director for the Wyoming Education Association. I've had quite a bit of inquiry regarding this bill and the one that is to be discussed next. A lot of my members have reached out asking, and I appreciate the good bringer of the bill walking through the process and the intent, but for the educators across the state who aren't so privy to our budget, their ask has been, what is the problem that this is looking to fix? Because at the end of the day, what they see is a cut to education funding. With the understanding, right, that the intent is to build those savings, to acquire more return on investments, to fund later. But gently, I will push back in that we are currently in a situation where we're having a discussion about whether we are funding to a level that we need to be funding for education. And so while I appreciate the idea of wanting to grow our savings, grow our returns, I think that there is at least some discussion to be had whether this is the right time to do this, given the discussions that we're having around education funding. With that, I'll stand for any questions.
Are there any questions from the committee? Representative Smith?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Mullen, when would be the right time?
Madam Chair, Representative Smith, I think first and foremost, at the end of the day, what we're always and have always advocated for is that we fulfill our constitutional obligation to fully funding education, and that funding is based off a cost-based model. Once we've established a track record that we're willing to meet those obligations, I think that's a perfect time to have those discussions. But I'm a little remiss to engage in those conversations when we are not currently and have not for quite some time been meeting those obligations.
If there are no other questions from the committee, is there anyone online who would wish to offer public testimony?
No, Madam Chair.
With that, committee, what's your pleasure?
Second.
We have a second. Let's walk through it page by page. Are there any amendments on page 1? Any amendments on page 2? Hearing none. How would you like to proceed?
Move the bill do pass.
Ms. Childers, could we do roll call?
Roll call vote, House Bill 270 do pass. Representative Alaman? Aye. Representative Angelos? Aye. Representative Bear?
Aye.
Representative Haroldson?
Aye.
Representative Pendergraft?
Aye.
Representative Smith?
Aye.
Chairman Sherwood?
No.
Madam Chair, 6 aye, 1 no.
Thank you. Committee, our next bill for consideration is House Bill 271. Mr. Chairman, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. So this will be round 2 of this, virtually the same discussion, but we are on a different page, and I did send out a handout. This is later on in the data book, but this is the spending policy. Well, this is a new one here, I'm sorry. Let me get the title in your 2025 data book, and this is called Fiscal Year 2025 Estimated Spending Policy, Wyoming Statute 9-4-719H as in hotel, Common School Permanent Land Fund, and basically what we're doing here is the same thing, but this is on the school foundation program. So again, changing the policy from 5% down to 4.5%. And this particular reserve account is the Common School PLF reserve account. This account is in already financially better shape than the one on the general fund side. We are approaching that 5X, so it's getting to that point where it's going to do really well. But we are seeing from year to year that dip lower and lower, at different times when spending policy pulls money out of that reserve account. So we are going to hopefully see, future bills that will eliminate some accounts that are not being used and put money into this account and get us over a threshold to the 5X where it'll always be able to handle the spending policy. But this will, again, move us up to the 7X faster, get a greater return, just like the discussion we just had, and that will eventually flow right back down to the school foundation program. So the suggestion in this bill would be to reduce it from 5% to 4.5%. The remaining funds would track back to the Common School Permanent Land Fund Reserve account. And with that, I'll show you in the bill where that shows up. You can see we have some limits, the $200 million. We also have some changes as to where the account goes to. We strike School Permanent Fund Reserve account, Common School Permanent Fund Reserve account, and we go to 9-4-601, which ensures that it goes into the Common School Permanent Land Fund Reserve account. And that's our 5X to 7X account. And then on page 4, you'll see we strike the 5% and we change that to 4.5%. And with that, I'll stand for questions, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Are there questions from the committee?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to try to summarize how I see this, and I'm going to ask if I'm seeing it the way that you do, if I'm accurately. By changing the spending policy from 5% to 4.5%, what we're doing is taking a smaller slice to be able to go and spend. But as the corpus grows, we're actually taking a smaller slice of a bigger piece of pie. Is that accurate?
Madam Chairman?
Mr. Chairman?
Vice Chairman Pendergraph, yes, that's a good illustration of what this would be. One thing I did fail to really describe is the fact that I mentioned it, that there's a spending policy that allows money to flow out of this reserve account, and those transfers are going to be happening regularly. They will continue to happen. It's just that they won't bring us below the 5X, so that the type of investments that the Treasurer's Office will be able to engage in will remain those investments that will get a higher rate of return.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Chair, my apologies. So then the second half of that is the goal of this, spend a little bit less right now, put more in savings, and that corpus would grow faster than the rate of inflation, meaning that we would have a net more money to be able to spend on the schools if it were so needed. Is that accurate?
Madam Chairman, I think this goes to the discussion that the representative from the Wyoming Education Association mentioned, that there's concerns about funding of schools, and it is a constitutional requirement. And I would address your question, Representative Pendergraph, in that we have a funding mechanism at this point that ensures that schools are funded at 100%. So what that is when the school foundation program goes below $100 million, the LISRA, the rainy day fund, if you will, backstops that up until the point where it is drawn down to $500 million or less. So as long as we have that backstop, even this restriction that was called an orifice by Representative Haroldson, or I called it a funnel, even that will not affect the actual spending amount within the school foundation program, within the model, within the block grant. But what this will do is change where those sources are. Those sources would change if we don't have enough revenues from mineral grants and other our state lands. Then the revenue stream from our investments right here in this bill would be reduced, yes, and you would have to, if you didn't have increases in those other areas, we would make it up in our LISRA account backstop.
Are there further questions from the committee? Hearing none, is there public testimony on this bill? Welcome again, Mr. Mullen.
Madam Chairman, members of the committee, I'll keep this brief. I didn't plan on testifying again to be repetitive, but I did want to expand on the point that the good chairman brought in the role of the LSRA as that backdrop. I think something that we should be keeping in mind throughout this entirety in this process is that there are a number of bills that are floating around out there right now that are going to have a substantial impact on funding as well as the outlay, right? So for example, lifting the cap on charter schools will be an additional cost. If we look at potentially the voucher program, that is going to be an additional cost that there has been an indeterminate fiscal impact. What we have seen in other states is the cost of those has just exploded over the years. So I don't imagine Wyoming being any different in those regards. At the same time, the property tax relief bills. So those are things that we need to keep in mind cumulatively when we're talking about this, because those all are going to have an impact on the ability to fully fund education in Wyoming. So with that, I'll stand for any questions.
Are there any questions for Mr. Mullen? Hearing none, committee, what is your pleasure? Is there a second? Second from Representative Haroldson. All right, are there any amendments here? Page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4. Hearing none. Can we go to the roll call vote, please?
Roll call vote, House Bill 271 do pass. Representative Alaman? Aye. Representative Angelos? Aye. Representative Bear? Aye. Representative Haroldson?
Aye.
Representative Pendergraft?
Aye?
Representative Smith?
Aye.
Madam Chair Sherwood?
No.
Madam Chair, 6 aye, 1 no.
Thank you. And with that, committee, unless there are further business, I believe we are adjourned.